We all enjoy hockey. Can we make it better, though?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Indeed. Start hiring now with the $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/lockedon. So today's episode came to me while I was eating my breakfast. I was skimming through The Athletic, and there was an article in there where they sat down and talked to Deputy Commissioner of the NHL, Bill Daly, about a variety of topics throughout the league, stuff like LTIR, expansion, the Olympics. There's a lot to chew on here, and I wanted to frame this through the lens of constructive and forward thinking. You know, this isn't going to be some exercise in futility. The NHL has some issues, and we're going to talk about some of them on today's show and how we might be able to resolve them, mitigate them, or in some cases, just eliminate them outright. So there's a handful of topics. We're going to bounce around subject matter. Some of these impact the Oilers. Some of these are more of a macro league-wide level. So starting at the outset, I think the biggest question we all have right now is, where is the NHL going? And by that, I mean, what do we forecast revenues to look like? Because that is going to ultimately determine the salary cap situation. And I think that is the single most pressing issue on every single fan's minds. If you're an Oilers fan in particular, you are definitely curious to see how revenue growth goes over the next handful of seasons, because that's how the salary cap is calculated. The salary cap is calculated based on projected hockey-related revenue. That's why money is held in escrow. So real quick, we'll do 30 seconds on how escrow works. So the collective bargaining agreement dictates that revenues be split 50-50 between owners and players. Every player has money taken out of their paycheck every week or whenever they get paid, if it's biweekly, however they choose to set it up. And that money is put aside. At the end of the season, if revenues haven't been divided evenly, that money that has been put aside in escrow by the players is paid back to the owners. And in theory, as we move forward into the future, as revenues grow, as non-gate and merchandise revenue streams grow, like television, like social media growth, like there are opportunities for the NHL to grow the overall pie of revenue. The biggest pot and the biggest opportunity they have is TV growth. They've locked in relatively medium-term contracts with both ESPN and TNT down here in the States. Up in Canada, that Sportsnet deal is going to expire in the not-so-distant future, and that's going to present an opportunity for massive growth. Because when you compare the NHL to the NBA, to the NFL, and to MLB, and to soccer, and to Formula One, the TV deals in the other leagues make up so much more of the overall revenue because their rights on television are worth a lot more money. And that allows more money in the system. That's why the NFL salary cap's over $200 million. The NBA salary cap is close to $200 million. Major League Baseball doesn't have a salary cap, but they do have a luxury tax threshold, which is somewhere in the ballpark of $190 million. So the NHL is very far behind those other sports. And a lot of that is derived from the fact that revenues in comparison to the other sports are down. It is not as simple as saying, oh, well, we just make the salary cap whatever number we want. That would not mitigate this issue. So at the outset of this conversation, we do need to talk about the NHL finding ways to grow revenue. The new TV deal, national TV deal in Canada, that is an avenue towards growth. And frankly, it's imperative because for two reasons, and it's one of the reasons why when we talk about expansion and next after this topic, that it'll come up, because Canada having 7 teams in the NHL, as opposed to in baseball where they have one, basketball where they have one, and the NFL where they don't have any, there are more opportunities in another country. You can sell your rights for more in Canada because it is such an essential fabric of the Canadian identity to have access to the National Hockey League. So with that in mind, I don't think there's a direct one-to-one. The only thing the NHL could do and the NBA and college football are doing this really well right now, is they can continue to parse out more and more of their games to different television partners. You could put a games package on another network. You could put a games package on Fox, on CBS, on NBC, maybe on one of the streaming services, on Amazon, on HBO, on Hulu, on Netflix. As we try and navigate this new media landscape, there will be opportunities for the NHL to grow the overall revenue pot and enable the players to make more money, and which in turn will help teams keep good players, that is my main interest in this subject. I want the best teams to be able to keep their star players. The way we do that, there are tools. The most straightforward way is just growing revenue so the salary cap goes up. We could do other things. We could do a soft cap. We could do what baseball does with a luxury tax. We could do what the NBA does, where there are all these exceptions. There's a mid-level exception. There are bird rights. There are a lot of ways to allow teams to keep quality players. And through the lens of the Oilers, this should be your biggest concern, is how we grow revenue so we can keep as much of our team together as possible. How do we keep McDavid and Draisaitl together at 30? How do we get Bouchard to come in under 10? So we're at 40 million for 3 players. And if the cap's 92 million, you can't have 3 players being 40 million. If it's 110, 120, then it becomes a bit more palatable. So revenue growth should be your number one concern as an Oilers fan. Number 2, the second subject on today's episode to touch on, expansion. I, for one, think the NHL is reaching a saturation point. And I don't mean that in terms of games or teams. I mean that in terms of the quality of teams. We have no truly great teams coming into this season. I would say we have about 6 true Stanley Cup contenders. We have about 10 teams that are going to flirt with playoff spots. And then that last 16, most of those teams know we're not doing anything. Even if we make the playoffs, we're a first round exit. With so many teams stuck in that middle, with no discernible path out of that middle, I don't think in good conscience you can add more teams to this league right now. I think the big issue, and this is something that's awkward for the NHL, they don't want to say, but there just aren't enough good players to go around. And at some point, you reach an inflection point where there just aren't enough high caliber hockey players to distribute amongst the number of teams, and it impacts the product. You know, I was talking about this last night watching Thursday Night Football with somebody. We're kind of reaching that point with the NFL where there are just so few good quarterbacks that it's hard to envision the vast majority of these teams being seriously championship caliber, because there just aren't that many good players at the most important position. And because of that, it creates a very big middle class of teams that have very similar ranges of outcomes that are close to the middle because they can't do a whole lot. And that's kind of where I feel the NHL is at, where you look at the standings, right? You look at the preseason cup odds right now. I think you realistically could pencil in 14 of the top 16 odds teams in the playoff spots right now as we sit here in September, because there just isn't a lot of opportunity for a team like the Kraken, or a team like the Ducks, or a team like the Blue Jackets, or the Flyers, or the Penguins, where even if they get in, they're going to get their doors blown off because they just don't have enough guys. And some of it is teams being mismanaged. That's definitely a factor in this consideration, but there just aren't that many great players in today's game. There are more great players than there ever have been. There's also 32 teams. There's not enough great players to go around, especially when you consider that the great teams hoard the great players. That's what makes great teams great. So we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about LTIR, the salary cap. We're going to talk about 3-2-1 standings points. There's a lot more to dive into on this episode of Locked On Oilers, so be sure to stick around. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance: superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with the national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insights on every team in the league, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So one thing we can talk about in relation to competitiveness, and I think ties nicely into this, the regular season is too long. The regular season is too predictable. There are too many games that don't have enough stakes. It is very uncommon for us to have genuine playoff races down the backstretch of a regular season. It takes, I don't want to say extraordinary, but out of the norm breaks of luck for things to come down to the last week of the regular season for more than one playoff spot. This past year, nobody was really good in the East once you got past the the six division teams. Once you got past Tampa, Boston, Florida, and then the Rangers, Carolina, and the Islanders. Even the Islanders didn't really deserve that third spot. They weren't particularly good either. But once you start unpacking it, once you start talking about, Toronto was in the Toronto was the third team in the Atlantic. Tampa Bay was a wild card team. I want to get that right. But there are too many games that don't have a lot of stakes, that are just one in a laundry list of 82 games. There are ways we could mitigate this. We could do a more division-heavy schedule in the regular season and make things a little bit more enticing for these teams to care about playing each other. We can do the 3-2-1 standings points allocation, where if you win the game in regulation, you get 3 points. If you win the game in shootout or overtime, you get 2. And if you lose, you lose in overtime, you get 1. I think that would solve quite a bit of issues, and it would incentivize teams to go for it. Part of the reason a lot of these regular season games feel a bit monotonous is the fact that with 10 minutes to go, if it's a tie game, both teams are going to okay, we're going to get our 1 point tonight and we're going to stay in the mix. You look at teams last year, like the Islanders, who had so many loser points, the Leafs, who had so many loser points. 2 years ago, the Calgary Flames had almost 20 loser points. You continue to put that incentive in the system where all you got to do is get to overtime, teams are going to take it. The vast majority of these teams know they are not serious Stanley Cup contenders. They are going to try their best. They're going to do what they can to hang around. And then if they get in, they're going to pray things can go right for them. The 3-2-1 points allocation is one way to do that. We can do a division heavier regular season schedule. Something else we could do. We can make the playoff format make sense. I personally would like to see this the most. Out of everything we're going to talk about today, going back to a 1-8 playoff format in each conference as opposed to 3-3 and then 2 wild cards, it would be fair. It would be more fair, and it would incentivize the good teams to keep piling on. It would incentivize the teams at the lower end to really push to get past 8th, 7th, or 6th to try and get a more favorable opponent in the first round. And it would give us fresh playoff matchups. Right now, it feels like we are stuck in an infinity loop of the Leafs and Bruins, of the Panthers and the Lightning, of the Rangers and the Hurricanes, of the Islanders and the Hurricanes, of the Oilers and the Kings, of the Jets and the Avalanche. I would like to see us return to the 1-8 format. You have the best record in your conference, you're the 1 seed. You have the worst record, you're last. You're the 8th seed. That's it. We don't need divisions. We don't need wild cards. This format does not incentivize teams to go for it. There are teams who are better off, who say, well, if we finish second, we'll get home ice in the first round against a lower quality opponent. I'm going to do that. And I'm not saying teams are throwing games. I'm not saying teams aren't trying to win. What I am saying is that we're all not stupid here. We'll understand that teams are going to strategically rest guys down the back half of the regular season, last 5-10 games, if they can get a better, more favorable playoff matchup. And people want to pretend it doesn't happen. It happens. it's tied directly to long-term injured reserve in that respect, where we all know what's going on here, but because teams like it, it's not going away. And we'll end this second segment talking about LTIR, but I would like the regular season to feel a bit less of a marathon. And we're never taking games away. I do want to emphasize that. The most obvious solution to this is scaling back from 82 to 75 to 68, maybe even to 62. But that's never going to happen because the NHL is such a gate revenue, meaning people buying tickets and going to the games driven sport. You're never going to be able to convince the owners to say, hey, let's lose 5 home games. You're never going to be able to do that. Each one of those home games is a couple $100,000 in revenue. For each ticket, the merchandise, the concessions, parking, all of that is a couple $100,000. If you're one of the bigger market teams, it could very well be over $1 million per one of those home games. You're not going to concede that. So instead of trying to parse down the schedule, we can make the games mean more. We do the 3-2-1 standings points. We do a 1-8 playoff format where 1 plays 8, 7 plays 2, 6 plays 3, 5 plays 4. It works for the NBA. It's good enough for me. I would like to see that format back in hockey because it will reward good play and penalize teams that are just trying to limp into the playoffs. Sometimes it might benefit you to limp into the playoffs as a wild card and get an easier matchup than you might get if you were one of the 2 division teams. And I'm not saying that happens where teams are consciously not trying to win, but we're all not dumb here. And speaking of not being dumb, we know what's going on with LTIR. And there's even less incentive to fix this than the schedule issues because every general manager looks around the league and says, I'm going to need to do that at some point. We can talk about it in regards to Vegas. We can talk about it in regards to the Oilers right now. We can talk about it in regards to the Lightning when they won the Stanley Cup, where Kucherov didn't play the entire regular season. We can talk about it in regards to Patrick Kane in 2015 with the Blackhawks. It happens. Teams do this. But because NHL teams want this tool in their pocket to be able to break out in case they need it, it's not getting fixed. And I know some people will say, oh, just have a salary cap in the playoffs. But the reason that doesn't work, it's twofold. Number one, the players are not getting paid in the playoffs. And then number two, that penalizes teams who responsibly manage their finances in the regular season. When you want to have the same salary cap for the regular season as you do, for the playoffs as you do in the regular season, it's not going to work. And I talked about this briefly on Wednesday's episode where we were talking about cap accrual being so important for the Oilers this season. That money you take on when you acquire a player at the trade deadline, it's prorated, meaning you're only paying the salary for their number of days left in the regular season. You don't have to pay the full cap hit. If you were to have a playoff salary cap that was the same as the regular season, you would not be able to roster the roster you would put together post-trade deadline, because instead of that player's cap hit coming in at prorated number of however many games or days left in the regular season there are, it would come in at their full cap hit, which would have meant that the Oilers couldn't have played Adam Henrique last year. That doesn't solve the problem either. LTIR, I think the only way you are going to see meaningful change in this department is if the NHL starts being a bit more difficult and a bit more stringent in its use. If they are going to monitor players' health and rehabilitation process a little bit more to streamline getting these guys back before the playoffs, I really think that's the only way. And the NHL swears they do a good job monitoring this, that they are on top of when players are put on LTIR. They monitor the rehabilitation and the physical therapy process so that teams aren't manipulating it. And as multiple people have written and multiple podcasts have discussed, the general managers like having this in their back pocket because they never know when they're going to need it. The Oilers are going to need it this year, more likely than not, in regards to Evander Kane. And there's early reports that Darnell Nurse might not be ready to start the season on time because he had surgery over the course of the summer and is still working his way back from that. So we are going to take one more quick break here on Locked On Oilers. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about international hockey and a whole lot more on this edition of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around. I, for one, am ecstatic we're getting international hockey back. It is one of the purest displays of sport. Those moments just linger. You think about Sid at the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver scoring the golden goal in overtime. You think about the miracle on ice. You think about TJ Oshie versus Russia in the group stages in the shootout in Sochi in 2014. I hope and I pray the NHL uses this as a vehicle to put their stars in a position to succeed. You think about how much genuine excitement there was around the Olympics this summer for basketball, where you got LeBron, Kevin Durant, and Steph Curry all on the same team one last time. Steph had never played with those guys in an Olympics because Steph had been hurt the last two Olympic cycles and hadn't been able to go. This is hockey's opportunity. You are going to send Sidney Crosby, Connor McDavid, and Nathan McKinnon to the same Olympics, all on the same team. This is Canada's moment. The United States is going to send Austin Matthews, Matthew Tkachuk, and Quinn Hughes. That is incredible. If we can get Sweden's best, and I'm going to pick my words carefully here because I want to be fair. I understand Russia's probably not going to be involved in the Olympics in 2026 because of geopolitical concerns. I understand that a lot of the other federations, especially in Europe, would refuse to participate in the Olympics if Russia was invited. Russia was not invited, and their athletes were not invited to compete under a neutral flag at the Summer Games this past year in France, because the international Olympic community, the international sports community, is trying to do what it can. I don't necessarily think that sports bans are going to end the war in Ukraine, but I do wish there was a way we could work this out. It is hard for you to tell me this is a best-on-best tournament if Russia's not involved. Russia is one of the 3 or 4 best hockey nations in the world. They feature some of the very best players in the world. You can't tell me it's a best-on-best tournament if Kucherov and Kaprizov and Shesterkin are not there. Now, I am also not dumb, and I understand that the political concerns matter. I understand that if you invite Russia, well, the Czech Republic's not going to want to participate. I should say Czechia isn't going to want to participate. Any of those Baltic nations are going to be very reticent to participate. And those federations look at this as an opportunity to lean on Russia, to put pressure on Russia and say, well, this isn't going to end the war, but this is another opportunity for us to exert some influence and say, well, we might not be able to stop this, but if we all band together and say Russia can't participate in these international opportunities, it will eventually start to snowball. And it is a very winding process. We're going on 2+ years of this now, and it's unfortunate for everybody. And I'm not trying to sound sympathetic to Russia, the country, because I'm not. You shouldn't invade the Ukraine, but this isn't a political podcast. So I want this tournament to be a showcase of the world's best. I'm very glad we're dipping our toes in with the 4 Nations face-off this upcoming year in 2025. It will be a nice appetizer for international hockey. It will be a way for some guys to play their way onto the Olympic teams. It will be a way for us to all gather together, and instead of an all-star game and a skills contest, which no one cares about, we'll get some skin in the game, because guys are going to be trying to play their way onto the Olympic team. You know, if you're not one of those first 6 for the 4 nations that are already confirmed, you probably are going to have to work your way. And this will be, I don't want to say auditions, but yeah, this will be auditions for the 2026 Olympics in Italy, Winter Olympics in Italy. If you have a strong 4 nations and then you participate in the World Championships at the end of the NHL regular season in May and June, wherever they happen to be this year, I don't know off the top of my head, that will put you in a strong position. Somebody, if you're like Wyatt Johnston and you're a kid and you don't think you're going to have the best of opportunities to make the Olympic team without doing something crazy, have a good regular season, get on the 4 Nations team, cook at the 4 Nations, go to the World Championships, play your way onto the Olympic team. I mean, somebody in this field of goalies for Canada is going to solidify themselves, whether it's Stuart Skinner, whether it's Jordan Binnington, whether it's Aiden Hill. One of those 3 guys over the course of the next 4 or 5 months is going to play themselves into being the starter for Team Canada in international hockey. That is the essence and the most raw form of sport there is. Outplay who you're competing with, work your way onto the team, and beat everybody. That's what sports is about, and it's why sports are the best. This is the purest form of the human condition. Here is your objective. Here is the venue. We all know the rules. Get from point A to point B without breaking the rules, perform well, and you'll get that opportunity. Life isn't like that, but a lot of the time sports are, which is what makes them so enticing from a human interest and from a sociological perspective. One last thing I did want to touch on this, make the NHL better. Bill Daley pretending the NHL rules aren't made up is hilarious, saying, well, these are professionals. We don't want to mandate neck protection. This isn't the Constitution. You don't need a convention of states. You don't need, I think it's 60 senators in the Senate to make an amendment. The rules are the rules. We made them up. We can, to quote George Carlin, they're made up. They're like the boogeyman. We can change them whenever we want. And we don't because of a lack of conviction. We don't want to upset people. We don't want to put people, oh, he might have to be safe. Oh, no. This is the same dumb logic you hear in all kinds of walks of life. There were people who were against wearing seatbelts, and we have systematically made seatbelts so commonplace that car deaths in relation to pre-seatbelt versus post-seatbelt are not comparable. Seatbelts, airbags, we can make life better. We should. Mandating players wear neck guards is very straightforward. The reason makes sense. This is not an infringement of rights. This is not an oppressive measure. This is safety. This is like wearing a helmet. It really shouldn't be more difficult than that. If you wear a helmet to protect your head, you should wear a throat guard to protect your throat. Pretending that this is some big, change is asinine, and it is meant to be a cop-out to say, oh, well, the players don't want it, nothing we can do. If the NHL wanted it, they can make it happen. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Fix the NHL Friday on Locked On Oilers. Hope everybody enjoyed today's show. Hope everybody has a fun weekend. The football slate's not great. There's good football, NFL football on Sunday. Bengals Chiefs, that's good. That's good ball. I'll be curious to see if Burrow looks right or not. Lots to talk about next week as we inch closer to the NHL regular season. But before we get out of here, if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live, and leave me a comment. What do you want to see the NHL do to make the game better? Do you want to see neck guards for player safety? Do you want them to ban fighting? Do you want to see 3-2-1 standings? Do you want to see 1-8 playoffs? Do you want to see an emphasis on international play? Do you want new teams? Do you want expansion? Do you want to change the way the schedule works? Let me know in the comments. Let's make this a bit more collaborative. I will talk to you guys on Monday, but before we get there, thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen today. Now, go check out the Locked On NHL podcast, where the season never ends and provides national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked On NHL in the description so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everyone have a safe, fun weekend. I'll talk to you guys on Monday. Until then, let's go Oilers.